All right, in today's lecture, we're going to continue with the themes that we've been talking about. And this week's theme is this notion of perceivability in UX design. So the first thing that I want to cover, the first principle that I want to cover is the 5 hat racks. Now the 5 hat racks have got 5 different sort of like approaches that we'll cover: category, time, location, alphabetical, and by hierarchy. And then the second principle that I want to cover is this notion of signal to noise ratio. Then we're going to look at affordance, which is actually a really important one, and we're going to look at the Zeigarnik effect. Now, the Zeigarnik effect is one of those interesting ones that it's not quite a UX-based principle, but it's not an aesthetic principle either. But I thought it's a really important one to kind of stick into this part of the unit, because as a strategy for pulling people into interactions, it's quite a valuable idea. And then we're going to wrap up and conclude by summing up the key points of today's class. Perceivability is really trying to answer the question, is information and the option interact obvious to users? So that's the kind of umbrella theme in which all of these principles that we cover today will sort of touch upon. If you remember as well, a couple of weeks ago, I gave this analogy that in UX, when you're trying to grapple with the themes, it's a little bit like the blind man and the elephant story. Anyone remember that? If you don't quite remember, it's this notion of there's a whole bunch of blind men, and they are all trying to describe an elephant, and each of the blind men is trying to grapple with or come to terms with a different part of the elephant. One is it's got his arms wrapped around the elephant's leg, and it says, the elephant is long and big and quite tall and quite round, bigger than a person. Another one grabs the elephant's trunk and says, no, elephant's very flexible, and And basically the idea is that by looking at the different principles, we're trying to grapple with this elephant, and the elephant in this case is this notion of perceivability. And there's lots of lenses through which you can analyze and talk about them. And the principles are helping us to kind of get a sense of this whole elephant of perceivability. Now the idea is that you try to understand the individual principles as best as you can, but really the thing that I need you to get is the bigger picture, right? How does perceivability fit into the user experience, and how can you leverage that in your own designs? All right, so let's take a first look at the 5 hat racks. Essentially, the 5 hat racks are saying that there are 5 main ways to organize information. You may have heard this term before, a term called information architecture. And the idea of information architecture is saying that not only is it important that you present information to people that they need, but it's really important how you organize that information, because if it's not organized in a way that's really logical to the users or in the way that they expect, then they just won't find the stuff. So it doesn't matter if you have good information on your website. If it's not organized in a logical way that aligns with people's expectations, then it's useless. So the first way that we're going to think about how you might organize information for your websites or your apps is by category, basically grouping by similarity or relatedness. You can use categories to organize information in so many different ways. For example, maybe by color, you might organize things, particularly if you've got a clothes shop and you're a clothes retailer online or a sneaker retailer. Sometimes it's important to allow people to be able to filter or look at things by color. Maybe it's based on, if you're a fashion retailer, people's body shapes. Maybe it's to do with gender. Maybe it's to do with model of the type of product that you're selling, whether that's a high-end, expensive, exclusive product or something that's sort of more budget, which is where price might flow into that category, or really any other thing, any kind of grouping that you think is logical. So the example that we've got here is a screenshot of McDonald's self-serve screens. It's different. You may notice that this looks different to the current McDonald's ones that we have here in Australia. I believe this is probably not an Australian one, and it was taken at a different time. But the gist of the interface, you can see, is quite similar, is that they're organizing food items into different categories. And in this particular case here, they've got them by burgers and sandwiches, right? So that's one way that this information here is organized. Can you think of other interfaces that you have encountered, whether that's apps, websites, or whatever, where you've noticed that they've categorized things by type of products or whatever? It's a really easy question. It's not a trick one. Clothing websites, yeah? So how do you notice that that's organized?
Go to like women's or men's or like tops and pants.
Yep. So by gender, by types of articles of clothing. What else? What other websites or apps have you seen where they've effectively used organization by category to make it? Sorry?
Photoshop.
Okay. So how in Photoshop is category used?
Tools organized based on what they do.
Excellent. So you've got all these different panels, right? In Photoshop, you have like the history panel, you've got the color panel, and each of these group together a particular set of tools, which makes it easy for you to find something. So if you know that you want to do something that's related to a particular function, you look for that tool palette, and then chances are the tool that you need is in there. Other examples that you can think of, very effective use of grouping things by category to help you find them.
Instagram, there's like on your own profile, there's like your feed, and there's reels.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, most apps do this. So Instagram is a good example where you've got your feed and then you've got other types of medium. There's stuff that's like trending sometimes. So you see this often in places like Amazon or even Netflix, like what's hot on Netflix at the moment, what are people watching? So this is groupings by category that's offering information up using this hat rack. Okay, so let's pivot to the next hat rack, by time. So time means grouping by chronological sequence, and using this mode of organization can be really useful if you're trying to find information in a chronological pattern. Right. So that could be in chronological sequence or reverse chronological sequence, meaning back in time or forwards in time. So let's have a look at this example that I've got here on this website. It's a history of computers website, and it lends itself really well. So this one's got a kind of a scrolling interaction where you can see, this is what computers were like in the 2010s with Windows 10 and mobile touch devices, things pushing to the cloud. And then as you scroll down, you go up to the 2000s where you've got Windows 7, you've got the old trusty BlackBerry, early versions of the iPhone. 1990s, you've got good old Windows 95, Microsoft Office, the birth of Microsoft Office. 1980s, going back to the Sinclair, the good old Game Boy. Who doesn't love the Game Boy? Floppy disks. Anybody remember those things? CDs. This was like cutting edge of technology at the time. Back to the 70s, we've got the Commodore, the original Macintosh, typewriters. Anybody got those around still? Going back further back to older. Intel, HP, these different things companies were founded, and then even further back to the 50s, where computers took up entire rooms, and the war efforts were aided a lot by those types of computers. Anyway, you can see that this is quite an effective way to chronologically present this kind of information because it's time-based, right? Can you think of other examples of time-based organization in apps that you use regularly? Time Machine, yeah. So on Apple devices, there's a kind of a backup system called Time Machine, and you can the interface actually lets you go back in time to show you like the way your files were organized on your computer like last week or a few weeks ago, and it actually backs up these snapshots in time. So that's a really nice example of chronological sequence. Any other things that you use regularly that you can think of that uses this chronology to organize things by time? So Instagram, like when new content comes out, it's like this is the latest stuff. We see this a lot with a lot of streaming services as well. Netflix, Stan, new releases when they come out, they kind of are featured on a carousel. So there's lots of ways that content can be presented by chronological sequence, especially to let people know about what's new, what's just come out, that kind of a thing. The third category or like organizational method is by location. So grouping by physical or geographical location. Organizing information by location can be really useful, especially where the spatial information is important to you. So for example, if you're looking for a particular destination, it really helps to pull up the Transperth map and then you can go, oh, well, so I'm here at Karrakatta. How do I get to East Perth? And having this geographical orientation really helps you, okay, to get that, to find your spot there. Now, this is not just for locational or geographic maps. This also can apply to like physical anatomical diagrams of the human body or any kind of locational diagram. So grouping by physical or geographical locations is another useful way to approach this. Can you think of apps or services that you use that leverage this kind of way of presenting information? Yeah. So any apps that have like this kind of mapping feature, things like Uber, Google Maps. Like, so if you go into Google Maps and you type out fast food, it'll show you all the list of fast food restaurants or supermarkets or whatever you choose based on location, on your proximity to you, and it lists them, right? Any other examples you can think of grouping by physical or geographical location where information is presented in this way?
The mini map at the corner of a game.
Sorry, the mini map at the corner of a? Yep. So often in games that have like a game world that you need to populate or you need to explore, there's sometimes a little snippet of a map that gives you a sense of your orientation of where you are in this game world. Right? And that can be really useful, particularly when you're exploring places, to know, yeah, I've been there, or no, I haven't been there. Now, the thing that you'll notice is that so far, the categorizations that we've talked about are not mutually exclusive, right? There's heaps of content, or like in Netflix or whatever, where they show you this information in multiple ways. So for example, Netflix is a good one. For example, it shows you like Australian dramas, right? But they also show you like latest movies, latest releases and things like that. So these hat racks are not mutually exclusive, meaning you can actually combine them. And sometimes combining and having lots of different ways for people to access information is really useful. The next category that we're going to look at is alphabetical, grouping by starting letter. Now we see this mode of categorization most commonly on our contact lists on our phone, right? So if you need to call someone very often, your phone will have them alphabetically listed by their first name usually, or you can get your phone to organize by last name. Now, organizing content alphabetically is another really effective way to present or sort information, especially if people know the specific terms or topics that they're looking for. But remember this idea that we were talking about, recognition over recall. You might remember like sort of what the word is, but you don't remember the exact word. That's when having an alphabetical list is actually useful, because as you go down the glossary or a list like that, you go, oh yeah, so that's the thing that I'm looking for, or that's the person that I'm looking for. Can you think of any examples of apps or interfaces where they've used alphabetical organization as the way to present that information? Can anyone think of?
File Explorer.
Okay, yep, so that's a good example. So in the Windows or Mac operating systems, the Finder or the File Explorer allows you to actually list the files on your computer alphabetically. So you can actually choose to filter it and show it in that way, which is a really great way to find, like if you're looking for a particular file name, but you're not exactly sure what the file name is, you can actually sort it like that. Any other examples you can think of, alphabetically listing of content or information, of examples that you've used or you use regularly? Yep, phone contacts. What else? Grab your phone and open it and have a look if you need to. Sorry? Yeah, searching for movies. Sometimes that's a way that you can organize things. So very often a lot of streaming services offer you the option to actually go down the list alphabetically to see, these are all the A movies. And that's actually quite useful, because you might remember that there's a movie, as I mentioned before, like a name of a movie, you don't know the exact name, but you know it's roughly this. And by scrolling down alphabetically, you get to see all the images and you see the titles and you go, yeah, that's the movie. I remember it was something like that. So again, this hat rack is not mutually exclusive. Like offering people lots of different ways to access the same content can actually be a really good thing. Now, when you start to design your apps and your websites, it's really important, especially if you have a lot of content, to think about offering users multiple ways to get at that content. Okay. Now, the final hat rack that we're going to cover is this notion of hierarchy, or grouping by prominence or importance. Organizing information by hierarchy can be really useful for showing how one thing is connected or related to another, especially if there's something like a particular order or prominence of importance. Right? Now the example that I have here is a screenshot taken from a Todoist. So this is a to-do app, basically like the list of all the stuff that you need to get done, or like shopping lists or whatever. And you can see that here the user is able to swipe and reorganize information. So one of the things that you might do when you create a to-do list is you might say, one of my to-do lists is stuff to buy at the supermarket. And you might put milk under there and then realize, oh, milk is really important. I need to put milk further up my list to increase its prominence or importance. And so to-do apps often have this kind of hierarchy that's flexible, that allows people to reorientate or organize information according to priority or importance or prominence. Can you think of examples where you've seen this kind of hierarchy used in apps that you use regularly?
I think like Instagram now, like in your followers, they put like the ones you interact with the most.
Yeah, excellent. So that's a really nice example on Instagram where the ones that people or accounts that you interact with the most are sort of featured higher up with more prominence in your feed, right, or on your list. So that's a good example. Can you think of other instances where you see that in other services, this notion of using hierarchy to organize information?
Shopping, online shopping, some of the like the latest features or the things that they want you to buy first is usually on top.
Yep. So there's a prominence, like a grouping of often in online shopping to do with like hottest fashion, for example, right? Or like most popular things. And we see this notion of prominence of importance, particularly for things that are popular. So on Spotify, on Netflix, often the things that most people are watching or listening to features further higher up the list to say this is prominent. But the other hierarchy, like we've already said, is actually stuff that you like. So we've kind of touched on this idea of anticipatory design in the past. Anticipatory design means things that you are interested in, right, get content pushed to you. The system guesses what you like, and that features more prominently in your feeds. So that could be based on previous stuff that you've looked at. It could be based on, people who are in your demographic, maybe your age group or whatever, that are enjoying particular sets of content, then that kind of stuff might be pushed to you based on preferences. Okay. So you can see that from these 5 hat racks that they're not mutually exclusive. They're just different ways to think about and organize information. And more services are leveraging all of these ways to be able to allow people to get at the content that they want to in a way that's most logical to them. Okay? So offering people this kind of ability to filter and to choose. So we see this kind of filtering function almost in any service that you see where there's a lot of content offered, to filter by date, for example, to filter by a number of hits. YouTube has this, right? So when you do a search, it lets you filter the search results by relevance. It lets you see by the number of views that it's had, by the number of, like when it was released in reverse chronological order. So try and offer people lots of different ways and think about which of the 5 hat racks are most appropriate to be like the default choice for a particular piece of information that you're presenting. Any questions about the 5 hat racks? So again, a lot of this stuff is really sort of common sense, and as a consumer or like as a user, you are clear, like, oh yeah, this is the way that the stuff is organized. But I need you to transform your thinking from consumer to creator, to being a designer. You have to actively leverage these ideas and think about how you're going to implement them in your designs. So the next principle we're covering is this notion of signal to noise ratio. So Lidwell defines it as the ratio of relevant to irrelevant information in a display. And really, the thing that you want to achieve as a UX designer is the highest possible signal-to-noise ratio in your designs. On the right side there, you can see 2 images of what seem like very common watches, but actually the one on the left is an example of a smartwatch, right? As with so many smartwatches these days, you can see that there's so many complications in this information. There's time, but then there's also date, and then there's like the weather, the moon cycles, there's heart rate, there's battery level, there's wind level. Oh my goodness, there's just like a million things on there. And then on the right side, there's the plain old regular analog watch, which has just got the time, right? Now, highest signal to noise ratio means the signal is very strong and the noise or the distractions are very low. So that's the kind of, you want to have lots of signal and low noise. That's the ideal balance. Let's look at a specific UX example. So this is screenshots taken on the left from Apple's Compass app. Now have a look at the difference between the screenshot on the left and the screenshot on the right. Essentially, it's the same sort of product, but you'll notice that the information on the left, the visual hierarchy is really clear. It's much more stripped back. The one on the right has got way more information happening on it, right? So if we look at the screenshot of the left on the Apple Compass, essentially, you've got the degrees, right, of where on the north, south, east, west facing that person is, and very prominently the visual hierarchy is showing you this information. So 120, 139 degrees southeast, right? That's where that person is facing right now. And it's got the elevation and the suburb and the location and the coordinates. Compare that on the right side. So the one on the right is a screenshot from the Commander Compass Go app. And this is a much more like so-called professional Compass app. It includes way more detailed Compass functions along with things like geographic and coordination features, but also elevation, right? There's also speed that you can see there. And there's all of this extra information there that kind of clutters the interface a lot more. On the top side here, we've got all of that data there that's being fed continuously. Now, the important thing to think about when you design your interfaces is to get that signal to noise ratio right, because the one on the left, for example, is a consumer compass. Most regular people just want to know, is it north, south, how many degrees, and maybe a little bit of information about the elevation. But if you are, let's say, a pilot, right? And chances are, if you're a pilot, the instrumentation on your plane will be a lot more like this, where you've got all this extra information, where the elevation information is really important, but also the orientation information relative to the ground, right? So you need to get that right balance, where in a previous lecture, we've talked about this notion of flexibility, usability trade-off, right? Of having the right amount of stuff. And if you do have to have more features, thinking about how you might present that information and those features in ways that don't overwhelm the users. So having a good balanced signal to noise ratio is really quite critical. A good example here is that this is a website example. Most car websites that you visit really focus on the product, right? Like the cars itself. They might have a search function that's like close to the top, and they generally try to have information where there's not a lot of noise, right? Like information about the product's really clear. So let me show you an example here of the North City Holden website. So this is like a fairly common kind of a website design. You've got hero image, which is this big, juicy, very nice looking image that's undistracting about the product being featured, and like little info boxes about other aspects or features that they want you to focus on. But you'll notice that the search function is super prominent here, like right at the top of the interface. And this is what I would call relatively high signal to noise ratio. Contrast this with this website. Whoa. You may have seen linkscars.com. This is an amazing website for different reasons. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on there. Like, pretty much anything that can move is moving. And the background is crazy busy. Like, you've got this almost psychedelic background going on here. You've got this animated GIF of this dude, or presumably that's Ling, on a motorbike, chewing and like jiggling and moving, and you've got this video in the background. You've got this animated bit here saying, my best-selling car leasing deals. The cars are jumping up and down like a 90s rap MTV music video, It's pretty intense. But if you haven't worked it out already, this website's actually pastiche. They did it intentionally like this to be like ultra cheesy. It's telling you now that there are 4 visitors on this website and 51 visitors today, and even all these lights are flashing, right? So in this particular example, the noise factor is super high. Like if you genuinely wanted to buy a car from this business, you'd probably have a little bit of trouble trying to work out, where are the models of cars that I need or whatever. So they're trying to use this as a kind of a marketing stunt to say, we're so quirky, we've got character, come on down to our yard and have a look at our cars. So whether it's a success or not, it's hard to say, but there's a lot of people, or at least a lot of design lecturers around the world using this as a great live example of a website where the noise ratio is really high compared to the signal. That's pretty awesome. Got Ling there, jiggling his or her head. Amazing. Anyway, so that's an example in the UX space of very high noise ratio, and generally speaking, the kind of thing that you would really try to avoid in your design approach. Now, one of the things that you may not realize is that you think that having a high signal to noise ratio is just good for kind of usability and good user interface experience approach. But actually, this stuff can actually matter to saving people's lives. Does anyone remember the Fukushima nuclear plant meltdown in Japan that happened, I think it was somewhere in the last 10 years? So if you don't remember, essentially sometime over the last 10 years, what happened was in one of the nuclear power plants in Japan, there's a company called TEPCO. It's a private company that ran this nuclear plant. And there was a meltdown in the core. And basically what happened is all of this nuclear kind of waste and stuff got pumped into the ocean. There was there's incidences of people of higher rates of cancer. And there's all sorts of health effects and fallout that happened from that. But essentially one of the issues, there was multiple issues and factors at play with the Fukushima incident. But one of the things that happened was the user interface for the person operating at the plant, the people who were keeping tabs on whether the reactors were in a safe zone or whatever, they were actually greeted with a really problematic UI that had so much information all at once presented to them. And it didn't, those of you who have watched The Simpsons and when Homer is sitting back in his chair, there's a scene at the start where all the lights go red and glitch and that did not happen. It was a tiny light on a panel that was signaling to that person, the operator, something's wrong here. That person didn't even catch on to it until it was too late. So there was a number of factors, but actually the UX for that thing really mattered. Now think about when you, if you've ever had the chance to, it doesn't happen anymore these days, but if you've ever had a chance to go into look into the cockpit of an airplane, the cockpits of older airplanes have got tons of dials on them. It's just this swarm of analog dials. And it's really hard to, in those, when a pilot's flying a slightly older plane, it's really hard to see which one's prominent and which gauge is not prominent because there's all of this attention, all of these gauges that are vying for your attention. In newer planes, the UI is much more streamlined. So, because back in the day, obviously they couldn't have all of this stuff on screens. They had to have individual gauges for everything. But now, the pilot has a contextual UI that comes up that shows them that what the system thinks is important stuff for them to see at that time. So they're not overwhelmed with lots of different dials to look in different places and stuff like that. So actually, the job of the UI designer, particularly for mission-critical things like those instances, is super important. So it's important to think about these ideas and these principles to not just ensure that something is usable, but in some cases, it can be life or death. Right? Any questions about this principle of signal to noise ratio? No? Okay, so let's pivot to the next one, which is this idea of affordance. And this is actually a really important idea in usability and in UX design. Lidwell describes affordance as a property in which the physical characteristics of an object or an environment influence its function or hint to the users its function. Now, there are two domains of affordances, the physical world and digital space. So let's kind of start with defining some of these ideas in the physical world to kind of help you get an idea of how they will translate into digital space, which is mainly the space that we're working in as UX designers. In the physical world, we can observe that products and objects have these kinds of physical characteristics which suggest or hint to us how we might use them. So have a look at the image of this very beautiful ornate teacup in the top right corner. What do you notice about the design of this thing that suggests some things about what it affords being used for and how it affords being used? What can you notice about the design? Yeah, the handle actually has got two like grippy, curvy loops. So some teacups have like a single loop, kind of a curve or a single loop. This one's got two. And what does that afford you? Yeah, to hold it with two fingers or multiple fingers in a more comfortable way. It affords, holding it in a slightly different way. Can you see anything else about the design? Very subtle design feature on this particular teacup. Yeah, so if you look really closely at the rim of that teacup, you'll notice that it's not perfectly circular. There's a slight kind of dip or indentation on one side. What do you think that might afford people to do? Yeah, so this is speculation on my part, but maybe it's a more comfortable way to put your lips on it, right? That there's like a bit more give on one side or a bit of a gap that you can rest your lips onto. We know that, what do you think the saucer is for? Let me rephrase that. What do you think that the saucer is used for, based on your experiences with saucers and the way that they are designed? Yep. So the saucer can be a way to like prevent spillage from the cup onto the table, right? What's notable about the design of a saucer that helps to keep the cup in its spot? Yeah, it's got a little indentation in the middle that kind of keeps the cup in a stable position as far as possible, right? So that design affords holding the cup stably in there. Now, there's another affordance to saucers that most people probably are not familiar with unless you live or have visited an Oriental country or a country in the Middle East where people drink a lot of tea. That image is giving you a hint at it, is that in some countries, like when I visited Turkey, in Singapore, I've seen this as well, where when someone's drinking a really hot cup of tea, instead of sipping it from the cup because it's so hot, they actually pour the tea into the saucer. And because the saucer has a larger surface area, you can cool your tea off more quickly and you blow on it. Has anyone seen that before? Yeah. So depending on your cultural context or where you have been, it's actually a thing. So saucers afford having tea poured into them and people drinking from them. Now maybe the designers of the saucers didn't consider that, but that's actually something that people do. So that could be a hidden affordance, which we'll talk about in a second. So coming back to the physical world, there are kind of three types of affordances that we can identify. The first one is perceptible affordances, and that's something that we've just discussed. Really, it's this notion that the way that something is designed, that visual design of the thing gives us an opportunity to infer or perceive characteristics of how we might use it. Okay? So that's what we call perceptible affordances. That by looking at something, we might get a sense, oh yeah, I can do this, I can use this to do that, for example. But the second one is hidden affordances, which I've just hinted towards. These hidden affordances are more covert. Maybe there are no obvious perceptible characteristics available, but a hidden affordance can sometimes be inferred by other evidence. Have you ever been in a situation before where you've got a cold beer in your hand and you don't have a bottle opener and you go, how am I going to open this beer? Anyone been in that predicament before? I've been in that predicament many times. And the more creative amongst you might get your car keys out because you've got your car keys with you and go, yeah, actually, the car keys hidden affordance is to open a beer bottle. That truly indeed can be a hidden affordance. In the same way that drinking tea out of a saucer and having that larger surface area to blow and cool off your tea and drink from it, that's also a hidden affordance. Now, the last affordance in the physical world that we're going to talk about is this notion of false affordances. They are obvious affordances that actually have no real function. So here's an example that I picked because it's just something that I know quite well. If you have a Samsung DVD player or a Samsung television, you might be familiar with this particular remote control. It's like, they call it a dual remote. If you look here, you'll notice that the dual remote has got two power buttons, like a circle button and a square button at the very top. And the idea is that from one control, if you own multiple Samsung products, you can actually run and control all of them from this single remote, right? So if, for example, you have a Samsung television and a Samsung Blu-ray, you can turn them on, you can change the channels, you can skip things, you can do all of these controls, you can change settings just from one control, which is pretty cool. But what if you don't have a whole bunch of Samsung products and you've just got one Samsung television? You've essentially got a remote that's got a whole bunch of false affordances because pressing that circle power button will do absolutely nothing for you. So it's a false affordance in that case because it's got no discernible function in a particular situation. So that's an example of false affordances. Now let's pivot and think about the digital space because this is the area that we're really working in, right? In the digital space, it's actually even more important, arguably, to think about affordances because the physical affordances don't apply because we're not working with physical objects. So Borowska, who writes an article on affordances, identifies some key affordances within digital interfaces. So the first one is essentially the digital version of perceptible affordances. But because you can't really call them perceptible because they're not tangible things necessarily, they're called explicit affordances in these cases. In these cases, rather. So explicit affordances offer hints by the appearance of an interface element and or any accompanying text labels. So the example that I've got here is a screenshot from a like a Delhi kind of a website, e-commerce Delhi website. And you can see that there's this little arrow here which brings your attention to this call to action button. And this call to action button says, sign up for 10% off your first order. And essentially, this is an explicit affordance to users because you can see that it's got this instruction, but it's encapsulated inside what looks like a button. And it's got a little arrow that hints to you, like this is something that you can do an action on. So this is what we call a call to action. Now imagine the designers didn't put this inside a shape and they didn't put an arrow on there. And all it had there was, it says like, sign up for 10% off your first order. You might not necessarily, it might not be explicit to you that this is an affordance to be able to press and do this. Even worse, like if they didn't phrase it well and it just said 10% off your first order, you might look at that and go, oh, what am I supposed to do with that? So it doesn't have an explicit affordance. But by the choice of copy that they've used, by encapsulating it inside what looks like a button shape with having the arrows, all of these signals and hints are giving you this messaging that this is an explicit affordance, that if you press this, something will happen. Now, have a look at that screenshot. What other explicit affordances can you see in that interface there? There's a whole bunch of them. Excellent. So in the quantity section, you will see what looks like a kind of a capsule shape, and there's a number in the middle, and then plus and minus on either side of that. So this is giving you an explicit affordance to say this is a button element that if you press minus, it would take the quantity down presumably, and that if you hit plus, you can add to the quantity. What other explicit affordances can you see in this screenshot? There's at least 3 or 4 really obvious ones in there.
The color change of the herbs.
Yep. Excellent. So when you look at that heading underneath the gourmet, there's a whole bunch of headings that say herbs, spices, seasonings, extracts, and I don't know what that word is. Never met that in my life. You see that herbs have got a pink kind of a highlight, right? And it's giving you this suggestion that, hey, hang on, this is, if I'm reading this correctly, this is the herb section, and you can see organic tarragon indeed is a herb. And that maybe if I click on some of those other sections, it might give me those categories of those kinds of ingredients that I might be able to order. So those are explicit affordances. So we can see other examples of that. In the top right, your attention is drawn to the shopping cart. The shopping cart button has a pink fill which kind of reflects the organic tarragon box color. And there's a number there, very tiny number, number 2. Again, these are explicit affordances that are showing you and saying, hey, you've got 2 things in your shopping cart. If you click this, then you will bring up the shopping cart to be able to edit what's in your cart or look at what's in your cart. Now let's pivot to the next idea of affordance in a digital space. This is what we call pattern affordances. Now this type of affordance leverages convention. The example specifically that I've included here is the hamburger button. This hamburger button now is so ubiquitous. It's used extensively in responsive web design and indeed in a number of apps. So you can see in that screenshot there, essentially in the top right side of the screen, there's this button that looks like 3 horizontal bars. Now I'm not sure exactly what the history or how this term hamburger button was derived, but there's some speculation that it's like, you know, the top 2 bits look like the buns of the burger, and in the middle is like the meat. I don't know, seems a little abstract to me. But anyway, that's what we now refer to very affectionately as the hamburger button. Now, pattern affordances can be good shortcut tools, but you need to remember that conventions change from time to time, right? And pattern affordances should really ideally be used in situations where your target audience understands that this is a convention and that you're actually leveraging this convention. So it's really interesting to note when designers first started using pattern affordances and more and more people started surfing the web on their mobile devices. Now, I mean, now we take it for granted. And in fact, a lot of research shows that the majority of web traffic actually comes from people using their phones and visiting websites on their phones. But in the early 2000s, you know, and late 90s and early 2000s, for example, where mobile phones and smartphones were not so ubiquitous and the bandwidth wasn't quite there, not many people surf the web on their phones, but the first few intrepid, you know, web surfers who visited websites on their phones, when they encountered websites that had the hamburger button, they were stumped because most people were used to visiting websites on desktop or laptop computers where there's lots of screen real estate and you can see all the menu options. All the menu options on websites are usually almost always available and in front of you. Then the first few people who started visiting mobile websites and they saw this kind of hamburger button, they got confused because they were like, what's wrong with this website? It's broken. Like, where are all the menu items? And they didn't cotton on and realize that this was a pattern affordance, that this is like a new convention that was coming out. Can you think of pattern affordances now that you've encountered that maybe were not so common but are becoming increasingly common in some of the interfaces that you use? Aside from hamburger buttons. Can you think of any pattern affordances? Yeah. Excellent, yeah. So like a lot of social media and, you know, well, indeed, you know, like email apps, messaging apps, use a little plus icon as a way to say, you know, to create a new message or to post something. This is a pattern affordance and a good example of a pattern affordance. We've previously discussed this notion of, or hinted to this notion of design conventions. Usually when you go to a website and you see the logo of the website, what can you assume if you click on that logo? Yeah, it takes you back to the home page. That's another example of a pattern affordance. Design conventions are that things like, you know, established UI language and UI behaviors that you can come to expect and rely on. So clicking on a logo often will bring you to the home page. That's another good example of a pattern affordance. Can you think of other examples of pattern affordances that you've met or encountered in interfaces? Sorry?
A cog on setting.
Excellent. So a cog button used to represent the ability to change your profile or your settings. Kind of weird, right? Like why would you think a cog has something to do with settings? But now it's so synonymous. We look at it, we go, oh yeah. I look at a cog and I go, that's like a gear thing and somehow it makes something turn. But we now understand that's the way you change your settings on almost any device or things. Okay, so just keep that in mind that pattern affordances can be good shortcut tools, but people need to know about it, right? So be conscious about the choices that you make in terms of your buttons and your interface elements. So the next affordance is this hidden affordance actually exists in the digital domain. As with the physical domain, hidden affordances in digital space may not be obvious. And this is an example that I've chosen that really bugs me. So, and that's the reason why I've chosen it. You may have experienced this too. Anyone here ever surf the Curtains Blackboard app on a tablet? Some people have, right? Have you ever noticed that when you visit the Curtains, like the Blackboard on a tablet, the menu item on the left disappears, the main menu disappears? Try it if you haven't done it before. So visit Blackboard with a tablet, and you'll find that what happens is in a second, even before, like if you're not looking out for it, you might not notice it. But you know how when we go to Blackboard on our computers, you've got that beautiful menu bar on the left that says like assessments, announcements, and all that kind of stuff. When you visit Blackboard on a tablet, that panel appears for like a split second, and then it slides off screen. If you blink, you will miss it. And once it's gone, there is no visual hint that you can actually, that there's a menu there. So this is a hidden affordance. So like in this case, I've taken the screenshot and I've highlighted it, but there's this very edge here of a tiny thing peeking out, which hints to you maybe there's something on the left. And I find this to be, as a UX designer, so problematic because you don't know. Like the first time that happened to me, I was like, what happened? Why is Blackboard not loading correctly? Where are all my menu elements? And there's not even a hamburger menu to suggest it's there. Look at that. How crazy is that? And this is a product that millions of people use every day, right? Millions of people around the world. So what actually happens is if you move your mouse over to the very left edge of the screen, your cursor changes. And then there's a visual feedback that lets you know, hey, something's here. And if you click it, then it slides out. But anyway, I find this super problematic. So this is a hidden affordance. Generally speaking, hidden affordances, as in this case, can pose usability problems, or people won't use them if they don't know that they're there. Or worse yet, people might have the perception that, this website's broken, or this thing's broken, I'm not going to use this. So try to avoid, as far as possible, using these kinds of hidden affordances. Now, what if your screen real estate was so limited that you had to somehow incorporate a hidden affordance? How might you do that better than what Blackboard has done? If you must have a hidden affordance. Yeah, so use a persistent animation that shows people, or have an onboarding process. You know, like sometimes when you use a new app or whatever, it steps you through the process and it says, first do this, and then do that. And so that can be a way to guide people to this hidden affordance. If you do something like, if it only happens in a split second, like with Blackboard, and then it's gone and you miss it, you'd never get that, right? So if you must do it, there are strategies that you can use to make it more obvious to people. Any question about hidden affordances in the digital domain? No? Cool. All right, the next one I want to talk about is metaphorical affordances. Now, this is particularly, like it's more common in graphical interfaces that employ skeuomorphic design approaches. So skeuomorphic design, or skeuomorphism, refers to design approaches that try to mimic real life, or like the physical things. So, a few years ago, those of you who have used Apple computers for a while, you may remember that when you hit the Contacts app in your Mac, you would get like what looks like a leather-bound version of the interface. You may or may not remember that. That's what we call skeuomorphic design, where it's like trying to mimic the real world. Now, in this case here, this example on the right, is that it's a stop-motion animation app that uses a photographic flipbook metaphor. And because it's using this flipbook metaphor, it's also using this metaphorical affordance of the way you might interact with a real flipbook. So if you're not familiar with stop motion is a kind of animation where you take a series of images and you cycle through those images quickly to get this feeling like something's animating. So things like Wallace and Gromit, or claymation is a good example of stop motion animation. And the way that works is you get your clay figure, you take one photo, you move their arms slightly, you take another photo, and then you do these slight movements and you take photos. And then as you flick through these images, you get this notion of an animation. Now in this case, because it's got this skeuomorphic design, you can see like it's got this wooden paneling there, and these images are encapsulated inside what look like photographic print paper. It's using this metaphorical affordance of sliding your thumb across, like how you might flip through a book, for people to be able to go through that sequence of images. So that's an example of a metaphorical affordance. Can you think of an app or a website where you've used where there's this kind of metaphorical affordance? This is a very common interaction pattern that we use that relies on this. It's probably so second nature to you that you don't even think about it. Let me give you a hint. Yeah, swipe to scroll. So you may not know this, but when swipe to scroll gestures first came out, there was like, if you swipe down, you would go down. If you swipe up, you would go up, right? But in the physical world, when you swipe up, actually you're going down. Like in this case here, I'm flicking this paper and it's taking you down the page. So then you see now the option comes up to like natural scrolling. Natural scrolling means like it corresponds with the physical world. When you push something up, you go down the page. So that's an example of a metaphorical affordance that's been used in a lot of operating systems, particularly in tablet and mobile, but even in trackpads now, right? We see this. Any questions about metaphorical affordances? I just thought of another thing. You know, we talked about pattern affordances and gestural interactions. Pinch to zoom. Yeah, you know this interaction? Like you want to zoom into an image, you pull your fingers apart, right? Like on a map, for example, on Google Maps. That's not a metaphorical affordance. In the real world, if you pinch something like this, nothing happens, right? But this is a pattern affordance. It's an example of a gestural pattern affordance. That more and more apps start to use this gesture that when you pinch, people go, oh yeah, I know. When you pinch, it zooms in, or when you do the opposite action, it zooms out. That's an example of a pattern affordance, but as a gestural thing, right?
The scrolling, the thing that you said, scrolling up and down, would you see that also gestural?
It's gestural for sure, but I would call it a gestural metaphorical affordance. And it's also, I mean, you could say it is a pattern affordance as well, because it's the kind of thing that it didn't used to exist as a way to interact with things, interactive digital things, but now it is. So that's an interesting one because it's a pattern affordance, but also it's a gestural interaction, but it's also a metaphorical affordance, right?
Is there any metaphorical affordances that's not motion or gestures?
That's an interesting idea. Can anyone think of metaphorical affordances that are not motion or gesture related?
Is that rubbish bin recycling?
Yeah. So the recycling bin is a metaphorical affordance. Yeah, that's actually a good example. When you see a rubbish bin, you know that like a recycle bin in your dock or on your Windows desktop, that's a place that you can put things that you want to get rid of. It's a good example of a metaphorical affordance. So these things are everywhere, right? And it's important to think about how you leverage affordances, because particularly if someone's never used your app before and you leverage these ideas, it makes it much more perceivable to them. They look at it and go, I've never used this app before, but I can get it. Like if I flick my fingers to the right, then it will flip through the thing, right? Now, as people get to using things more and more often, that's when pattern affordances become more of a thing in the way that they interact. Because if they didn't know about it before, they'll get to know about it now. But if you want to make your products, your digital products more accessible and more perceivable, right, and more approachable, then leverage these notions that people can use their existing knowledge to make guesses about how they could interact with something.
So dragging folders from one place to another place is also
Yeah, I would argue that it is. Because you're moving something from one spot to another, right?
yeah, we just
Which is what we do.
drag and drop.
Yeah. Good. Okay, the next one I want to talk about, and this one's a slightly tricky one, is the Zeigarnik effect. Now, I mentioned this before. The Zeigarnik effect is not quite an aesthetic principle, but it's kind of like it's an interaction principle. But I feel like it's an interesting one to throw in here because I wanted to introduce these to you to inspire you in your app designs when you get around to developing your own app prototypes. And Lidwell describes it as a tendency to experience intrusive or interruptive thoughts about a task that is left interrupted or left incomplete. So another way to kind of frame this is to say there's a psychological tension provided by an incomplete state. Like when you don't finish something, there's a tension in us that prompts us to want to finish that thing, for example, right? Or to want to keep our minds trained on that thing. So has anyone here ever done a Rubik's Cube? Yeah. How many people here reckon like you're pretty awesome at the Rubik's Cube? No, yes, no. But have you felt like that pull that you start to move it and you go, I'm gonna try. And then, like 5 minutes later, you're like still trying and you still haven't got it? It's leveraging this idea of the Zeigarnik effect because your brain wants to resolve this puzzle. Your brain wants to fix this thing or finish this thing. And so you feel like you're prompted to want to engage with this and to keep going with it. So in the UX space, we see the Zeigarnik effect used a lot now, actually, and increasingly so. And designers are using it as a way to get people to remain engaged in the app or to come back to that, like to keep coming back to this app. So here's an example taken from Audible. So the app Audible is it's a Amazon product, I believe, and it's their kind of audiobook version of their service, right? Now, they incentivize people using their app with badges. And we see this approach used a lot in gamification. So Audible's slogan is listen more, right? So they want you to use their product more. The more time you spend in there, the more stuff you listen to, the more money they make off you. So they want to incentivize for people and encourage people to remain engaged with the app and listening. So like you can get badges. Look at your stats. It says here, attention must be paid. Do it a lot and you're well on your way. And you get badges for, there's one that says marathon there, which means that if you keep listening to lots of books in a row, you get the marathon badge. If on the weekends you really smash the audiobooks, you get weekend warrior. So there's all these different things here that they're kind of like enticing you to engage so that you can get that next level. Have you ever had that feeling like when you play a game, like a puzzle game like Candy Crush or Tetris, where you go, just one more line or just one more level, and then next thing you know, you're like 5 minutes later, you're still there? I get that all the time for me with Tetris. So I just have to keep getting the next level and the next level. And this is the Zeigarnik effect at play. Here's another UX example. Habitica is a gamified habit tracking app. Habit tracking apps have really taken off since COVID because habit tracking apps are a way for you to cultivate positive habits for yourself. So things like, getting into an exercise routine or meditating or, eating healthy or drinking water, lots of water. These are all kind of habits that people are trying to cultivate. And so this app, Habitica, their slogan is motivate yourself to do anything. And it actually uses gamification techniques to encourage people to stay engaged with the app and consistently track their habits. So they're incentivizing for you to kind of, create your task, to engage with this process. And every step along the way that you do it, you get a little kind of, a little reward for doing so. And we see this in a lot of other different apps. So in this example, the user creates an avatar, and then they complete tasks to earn gold, which is kind of in-game currency. Even though this is not a game, right? It's actually a habit tracking app, but they're gamifying the experience. And then when you collect enough currency, you can use this to purchase custom rewards or cosmetic things like clothing and accessories for your avatar. These are not real things. These are like just virtual cosmetic things, but it keeps enough people engaged and motivated to keep working towards their goals. Can you think of other apps where this kind of gamification is used to suck people in or to encourage them to keep engaging? Yeah, so what are the incentives that they offer and how do they gamify that experience? Excellent, yeah. So a lot of exercise apps, and the specific example is like the Nike Run Club, that if you do this particular challenge or if you run this many kilometers, you get a little badge that says, you did this, good on you. And then they've got like, even in some of them, they've got like famous coaches and stuff that'll give you like a little motivational pep talk and like, you're doing great, only 1 more K to go and stuff like that. You've burned this many calories in 1 day. So it's a lot of these app ideas are leveraging gamification and the Zeigarnik effect to pull people in and suck them in. Other examples that you can think of apps where you've seen the Zeigarnik effect. Sorry?
Using streaks, like to not break the streak.
Excellent, yeah. Streaks are actually really common now. Like almost like any app that you engage with has some kind of a thing about streaks. Like how many days in a row you've used this app or you've done that particular thing, And if you get a certain number of streaks, you can level up and things like that. So this is a great example of the Zeigarnik effect where you feel like, you've got things in train and motion, and you're trying to, you want to get to that next rung. You want to keep going so that you get that next level. Any questions about the Zeigarnik effect? So I put some links here at the end of the lecture. I mean, this pretty much concludes the lecture, but I put these links to LinkedIn Learning. There are some really great videos on LinkedIn Learning, and there are the URLs to them, actually produced by the authors of the Universal Principles of Design book. So the book that is listed in Blackboard as a kind of essential text that the Curtin Library has, if you find just reading the definitions in there maybe not broad enough because they're very specific examples, there's some really nice videos here that show you these things and present this information in slightly different ways. So I encourage you to check those out. I want to quickly show you the Zeigarnik effect video because I think that's quite effective. But I won't show you the other ones. Just check them out when you get a chance. So let's have a look at the Zeigarnik effect video. Now we see this in like Netflix series. Anyone? I'm sure a lot of guilty people in here, like guilty on binging on TV series. And the ones that hit you the hardest are the ones where they leave you hanging. And you go, I just got to watch that one more episode. And then 4 hours later, you're still watching episodes on Netflix, right? This is the Zeigarnik effect in full effect. So again, as a consumer, as a user, you probably experienced that, but now use that force to draw people into your app designs, into your game designs, into your website designs, thinking about how you might leverage this. All right, to conclude, perceivable design considers whether or not information and the option to interact with a design is obvious to users or not. So think about these principles of the 5 hat racks, signal to noise ratio, affordance, and particularly the Zeigarnik effect. So you can leverage them to make your designs more perceivable to users, but also draw them in a little bit more, okay? Does anyone have any questions about the theme of perceivability in UX that we've covered today?